Yes, I am. I'm here, sort of, halfway.
I'm sorry.
All right, I guess we're ready. Are we ready?
Yes, sir. It's all you.
All right, good morning, everybody. You're in the saltwater sea level rise inundation presentation. Just to let you know where you need to be. Hopefully you're in the right place. This is the title of our presentation. It's kind of long, and I've changed it about 6 times, I think, to more accurately portray what we're actually talking about today. A lot of the ideas presented here are sort of futuristic maybe, or food for thought for where we need to go in this whole issue of sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. But we think that these thoughts are possible. Obviously, some of the recommendations we make or some of the ideas we put forward are going to be producer specific, they're going to be site specific, they're going to be soil specific. And as time goes on, we'll be developing, refining guidelines and recommendations, and through the form of technical notes and information on our website and those sorts of things. So I guess here we go. This shows a map of where the salt is impacting our land in the United States. About 6% of the land globally is impacted by salts in one form or fashion. Most of the issues in the United States are concentrated out in the west, southwest, north central states, down in the Gulf region of Texas, and a lot of these areas are actually affected by sodium, which we refer to as sodic conditions. However, here in the Mid-Atlantic, southern New England, most of our issues are related to sea level rise, saltwater inundation in the form of soluble salts that are impacting our ag land, and that's what we're really going to focus on in this presentation. If we look at the areas that are most vulnerable here in the East Coast and in the Southeast Coast, there's a prediction that in the next 100 years there's going to be about a 2-foot rise in sea level. So these areas in red are the highlighted vulnerable areas. And obviously in the Mid-Atlantic we have this area, Delmarva, Chesapeake Bay area, in southern New Jersey and in Delaware along the Delaware Bay shore. We're seeing problems already, as well as down here on the eastern shore. Down through Georgia, North Carolina, the back bays behind the Outer Banks, Pamlico Sound area, down in the Gulf Coast, in Louisiana and southern Florida. So these are the areas that are most vulnerable and that are experiencing problems now and will only get further exacerbated as time goes on. In 2014, the NRCS, the agency I work for, developed a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. And in that, it specifies that, well, some of the predictions are that coastal storms will increase and cause damage. And yeah, that's happening, right? Sea levels are predicted to rise 6 to 8 inches over the next 40 years or so, next 4 decades. Yes, sea level rise is happening, and it's impacting agriculture. It's impacting infrastructure also, for that matter, but we're more concerned here about agriculture. And what are the resulting impacts? Increased salinization in near coastal waters, increased flooding frequency of these marginal lands, these transition lands between tidal areas and agricultural production lands. We're seeing changes in plant adaptability due to environmental shifts, and we're looking at that in our plant materials program as how can we adapt our plant recommendations based on climate change, based on sea level rise, based on saltwater inundation. We're seeing potentially increased competition from invasives, which is always a problem, and increased soil health challenges. So these are all things that were specifically spelled out in the assessment plan and vulnerability plan. Just to give you an example, like here in North Carolina, we have a mosaic of ag land surrounded by fingers and tongues of tidal water. We have the same situation in southern New Jersey and on the eastern shore of Maryland, where you have your tidal marsh, you have your production fields right up to the edge of the tidal marsh. Increasingly, the marsh is encroaching on the ag land. Some of the addressed resource concerns within NRCS that plants or plant solutions can actually help with, and that we're looking at in our plant materials program, Things like soil erosion, so establishing a good buffer along the edge of the field to control erosion. Soil quality degradation, again, the increased amounts of salts in the soil, reducing the productivity of that land. And water quality degradation. So, in localized areas, groundwater quality is also impacted by this problem. Here's a sod farm, just as an example, not far from our plant materials center in Cape May, where the salt water is encroaching, has been encroaching for a number of years. You see the dead cedar trees out here, and that continues to expand inland. Obviously, in the foreground is the area that used to be sod, which is now basically nothing. And the producer's interested in some recommendations on what they can do here, either changing up their operation, putting in buffers. They're talking about maybe moving this road a little bit further inland and planting this area here to a native buffer to help sort of protect their fields a little bit more. So these are all different potential options. Another common site is the Phragmites expanding there in that marginal area between the forested woodland and the marsh. Very common scene in Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay. And a couple years ago, we actually assessed in our plant materials program, we assessed what the needs were in the individual states that we service. And these are some of the things that we got back as far as areas we need to focus on to help with this particular problem. Saltwater buffer recommendations for marginal cropland and edge of fields. That was Delaware and North Carolina actually came back with that recommendation. Refining coastal plant selection guidelines, Rhode Island. Plant recommendations for saltwater intrusion, Delaware and New Jersey. Addressing stream bank and shoreline erosion issues adjacent to cropland. You can see the 3 states that specified that. And then we got from Connecticut, we got in control or suppress the spread of invasives like Phragmites using native plant materials. So these are all areas within our plant materials program, specifically at Cape May, that we're actually starting to focus on a little bit more and putting a little more attention towards based on the needs of the states in our agency that have expressed. There's a couple terms thrown around here in this presentation is mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is lessening the impact of something that's happening, like saltwater intrusion. Adaptation is, and that's more of a short-term fix. What's the short-term fix? How are we going to mitigate this particular problem short-term, or something that's a little less frequent, as opposed to adaptation, which is basically changing the way you do business or changing your production systems or looking sort of down the road a little bit further, a little bit more long-term situation. So in mitigation, it's more of a short-term solution to lessen damage. It's best implemented if it's more of an infrequent event or if it's less severe. If you're in a situation where it happens all the time, it's happening with a greater frequency, a producer, planner, whatever, somebody assisting a producer, may need to consider longer-term adaptation strategies. And these are there's some thoughts and ideas we'll present as we go through this talk. Again, it's very site-specific, it's very producer-specific. Some guidelines still need to be developed and refined, and we will do that as time goes on. But if you have a field like this, do we necessarily have to totally abandon this? Can we mitigate this short-term to make it suitable for growing a crop? Or if we are abandoning it for crop production, can we grow something else in that field that could actually produce an income? Those are some things we're going to discuss as we go along here. So some mitigation strategies on the short term, and again, it's going to be soil and site specific, but allowing salts to leach through either through natural events or irrigate with fresh water if a field's been impacted by, say, a storm event, Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Irene, which greatly impacted the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, that's when we really started getting some calls from folks in our service centers and things. Was after Hurricane Irene. I forget what year that was. But anyway, it was 10 or 11 years ago, something like that. And that's when we really started getting calls on, what do we do now? We got fields out there that are inundated with salt water. So it's been going on a while, but this whole effort's been accelerated now with Hurricane Sandy and all the more common nor'easters we're getting, the more frequent storms we're getting. Gypsum's a possibility, although gypsum is more effective in a finer textured soil where you have more exchange sites. So you're basically what you're doing is you're bumping the sodium off the exchange sites in a finer textured soil and replacing it with calcium. It's not as effective on sandy soils because the sandy soils don't have the affinity to hold sodium anyway. But again, it's a potential option, and we have a conservation practice standard in our Field Office Tech Guide 333 that addresses this particular issue. Incorporating organic materials into the soil to basically by adding organic material to the soil is a positive thing in itself, but you're also diluting, quote unquote, diluting the salts that are in there. Growing cover crops for one season or in rotation with maybe some salt tolerant vegetable crops or commodity crops. The small grains in general are pretty tolerant to a fairly high level of salt. Barley is especially tolerant to salt. But things like sorghum Sudan grass, canola, a number of the brassicas in the brassica species, some millets and tall wheatgrass are all species that inherently have pretty decent salt tolerance and can help ameliorate the situation. Some other considerations are our agency does have a saline and soil management standard, which pretty much concentrates on conditions out west, but there may be some considerations in that standard that we might want to consider here. That's the standard practice 610. And then deep tillage is another potential option you're incorporating organic matter into the soil by doing some type of tillage, which is a positive thing. If you have a compacted layer or a zone where it's not allowing leaching to occur, you can actually break up that compacted layer potentially, and so you're allowing for some leaching to take place. And just to show how salts are measured in the soil, you have different concentrations of salts that different plants, both crop plants and also conservation plants can tolerate. And there's a fair amount of information in the literature on vegetable crops and commodity crops and what their salt tolerances are. We're interested in looking at what some of the upper level of salt tolerance of some of the conservation plants we use, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But this is just the general scale of that's used to identify whether the site is low, moderate, high, or very high or excessive from a saline or sodic situation. And I think there's our soil health people have a tech note that actually addresses this and describes it in a little bit more detail. So there's a researcher with NASA actually who has some interesting concepts about using halophytes or salt-loving plants for agricultural purposes. He's at the Langley Research Center at NASA, and he says, basically I stole this slide from him, one of his talks, and he says that, the conventional wisdom is that, that salt is disastrous to agriculture. He looks at it from the opposite side, and that, we have opportunities here. We might have to change the way we do business. Yes, certainly we have challenges, but we also have some opportunities. If we look at saltwater components, well, first of all, 97% of the water on the globe, on the Earth, has some level of salt in it. So we have to try to utilize that resource as best we can. We'll certainly run out of the salt water. It has a wide variety of minerals, particularly micronutrients. So he says that approximately 80% of the nutrients that are required for agriculture are already in seawater. But we only need to add the macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and maybe a little bit of iron to actually get a good crop. So again, this creates challenges as well as opportunities. And it's you can actually find a lot of information and PowerPoints and things on the website if you just Google his name, Dennis Bushnell. And so anyway, he even lists the University of Delaware Halophyte Biotechnology Lab that Jack and Denise have worked with, or basically are. He recommends that group as a great resource of information in this subject. Some of the adaptation strategies are, obviously you can abandon those lower lying flooding areas, and move your crop production a little bit further inland or at higher elevation, plant more salt tolerant crops, whether they're inherently salt tolerant or whether they've been genetically improved. And there are, some efforts out there to genetically put salt tolerance into crops. Establishing salt-tolerant native plant buffers, that's kind of the area that we focus on at Cape May at our Plant Materials Center, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go through this presentation. The other thing we can do in our plant materials program is tighten up the recommendations and make sure there are species in these conservation practices that are options and some diverse recommendations for salt-tolerant species, which again we need to make some improvements on. Some of these conservation practice standards have some limited guidelines for using salt-tolerant plants, but we can definitely improve on those recommendations, and we will be. So the area that we want to focus on now is sort of looking at opportunities is growing value-added alternative crops or conservation plants. And so for the rest of this presentation, we're not going to focus on the problem, which I kind of just talked about, but we're going to focus on potential opportunities. And at this time, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Jack Gallagher with the University of Delaware Haliphyte Biotechnology Lab. There you go, sir.
Thank you. There's the clicker.
Oh, yes. You need the clicker.
I need the clicker. Keeps wanting to steal the clicker.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. We're going to take a look at some crops in quotes because some of them are used commercially, some of them aren't yet, but we'll talk about those. And you have some handouts that Denise, I think, got everybody some handouts, and those will help us. Some of them we won't talk too much about because they're fairly complicated. So you can take those with you. I have some examples of some of the products up on the table there in front of Chris. After we're done, you can come up and fondle those if you like. And anyway, the first one we're going to talk about is seashore mallow, Costalitzkia pentocarpus. It's a member of the Malvaceae, same as cotton and the same as okra. And it is in the brackish marshes, about half-strength seawater is about as much as it likes. And it's a perennial, lives perhaps 10 years, 5 to 10 years. It's not invasive like some things like Phragmites and all. And it has some oil in the seeds and what have you. And it's sort of like a soybean in a sense. The seeds are about the size of sorghum. And so it is one of the things we're going to talk about. It's located in native stands from Delaware all down to Florida and across the Gulf Coast into Texas, and it also occurs in other places around the Mediterranean and Bermuda, for example. Back in 2009 and 10, Denise and I took a trip down the Atlantic coast and collected all along the coast there from places we could find. It occurs only scattered in the marsh, and you can't really pick it out very much because it's green and everything else is green. So you go in the early fall, and we called it the hunt for pink September. And we were looking for the pink flowers, and that's about the only time you can really easily find it. But we picked up and now have about 50 different accessions in our collection, and by spring we'll have those seeds from those saved in the seed bank that Chris has over there in New Jersey and also in ours. Right now everything's in our collection, and we could lose them. Something happened. So we have those, and we dug them out of the marsh. As Denise is telling me where to go and dig, and I'm out digging. She tells me where to go lots of times, and I'd always do it. And we dug them up and brought them back in the truck, and we grew them in the greenhouse and planted them out in plots that we have, both in freshwater and in saltwater, both greenhouse and field, and did some testing on the salinity tolerance of the plants from the different accessions. And as you can see here, it turns out there's quite a bit of difference in them. The ones here on the left are South Carolina 13, and in the background there that's flowering is the Delaware 22, and then there are some others that are from Texas and the like here, which are earlier in their phenotypic development at that stage. We had very observant people out there looking and collecting data on the plants as they grew, what the characteristics were and the rate they grew and all that sort of thing. And we find things like in one case, this is actually just one plant that was particularly synchronous in its flowering, so that everything was, almost all of them were at the same stage of development. So that was nice agriculturally. If you're going to go out and try to combine the material, you had everything on that plant pretty much in the same state. In other cases, it takes several weeks for them to that flowering period. The seeds differ in size, and you can see these are, as I said, about the size of sorghum. And here are some of the characteristics, the plant height, and we have across the bottom here of the x-axis is the different selections from North Carolina, this is Florida, and so on, and how high the plants grew. This is up to, at this stage, they were about 1.5 meters, a little more, and these are down less than 1 meter. It's a truncated scale here. But you can see the red line is grown in salt water, the blue line is grown in fresh. So you see, in that case, the salt did make the plant shorter. In other cases, like the flowering period, over here, there's not much difference in most of them in when they flowered in terms of whether they were in salt or fresh. The seed yield was higher in the fresh water than it was in the salt water in most cases, but the seed weight was not much difference. So the yield then was a function of how many, not how big they were. So that's kind of nice in a way in terms of handling it and combining and sieving and that kind of stuff. So those are just a few of the characteristics that we measured. Another one was the stem diameter. Some of them have few big stems and some have lots of little stems. And here's a stem. It's about a medium-sized stem with the bark off, and you can pass that around. Pretty heavy, be careful. Can make nunchucks. Anyhow, that is one of the characteristics that is different, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later. The genetic improvement that we've worked on has been just selection from the populations that we have, and an example that is a 6-podded one versus a 5. It's not all controlled by genetics, however, so you don't get it too reliably. The breeding is easy because the flowers are a couple of inches in diameter and great big things you can easily see and handle. Denise worked on looking for somoclonal variation. Here we've worked with the tissue culturing of it, and we've done a little bit of genetic engineering, put a couple of genes in, but we haven't done too much of that. It's not too, people are sort of afraid of genetically engineered things, and when you have a wild plant, then they think you're going to create, Frankenstein, it's going to take over the world or something. So we kind of backed off of that. As far as salt tolerance goes, genetic engineering to deal with salt tolerance is difficult because salt tolerance is complicated. It often involves quite a few different pumps, different places in leaves, sometimes in the roots, pumping sodium out. It involves producing glands, which are several cells in size, and so it's not easy to move that much gene and get the right things in the right place at the right time. And if you're dealing with producing one chemical like glycine betaine as an activity against salt, that's a straightforward thing. Superoxide dismutase, putting that gene in, we did that, that's not hard. But when you go to try to put in a whole salt gland that is in the leaves, you're talking tough business there. And so I'm not terribly enthusiastic about the prospects of doing a really big thing with, say, corn by putting salt glands in corn. but someday somebody will do it. But in the meantime, we go where nature has produced these things already. And they can handle them in ordinary equipment. This is the Freeman's planting in the no-till and till situation using what they use for soybeans with a sorghum plate instead of the plate they use for soybeans. When they come up, looks sort of like a soybean field, and they flower in the night about 3 or 4 o'clock, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you got to get up before you go to the barn to milk the cows to check them out. But they are only open one day and they close, so that is a handy thing for breeding purposes. They're pollinated by bees, flies, hummingbirds, and the nectar is located down at the base there where the arrow points. There's a drop of nectar, 5 of them. And the stigmas are out here. The anthers form a collar along the style. And then if nobody comes and pollinates by noontime, the stigmas say, well, it's time for us to do the job. And they curl back and touch the anthers and get pollinated, self-pollinated. So you always get seed, even though you don't have a pollinator. This is the field partially flowered. This is Delaware 22, which flowers over about 2 weeks of time, so you get some of the seeds mature before the others. You pick the time when it's most of them are mature, but before they start to shatter, and we cut it with a Ford hay conditioner, a hay bine of the Ford extraction. As you can see, it's not new equipment. And then leave it in a windrow for about 5 days, and then it dries out quickly. You saw, those of you who've seen the stems, you see that they're pretty light. And then we have a pickup reel on the front of an old Massey Ferguson 510, and it picks up and combines it, and we end up with bags of seed like this. And I have all this material up here on the front. Afterwards in the break you could come up and take a look at those things if you like. And then the straw is baled in the normal fashion. And we then sit back and wait till April and the plants come up again. They live 5 to 10 years. You see that as they get older, you get more stems per plant. And this was some that was planted in 2006, and we get 1 stem per seed. The next year we averaged about 4, then 6, then 11, and then 13, and it would sort of level off in that. This is Delaware 22. Some have fewer, some have many more, maybe up to 100, depending on the size of the stems. This diagram you have, which shows the products that we have come up with there. We started off focusing on the grain, like a meal, and then when biodiesel became significant, then we started to look more at the oil. And so that now with gasoline down around $2 a gallon, there's not so much interest in biodiesel as there used to be. So then we have been looking at other products as well. And Denise said that we need to have it self-subsidizing because we can't count on government subsidies to keep the thing going. Give them $1 a gallon or more to make up what we're losing on because of the high costs and so on. So we started looking at a whole bunch of different things, and you can look at those and study that at your leisure. We'll look at a few of them as we go through here. And the first one is the flowers. They fall off about 3 days after pollination, and only the ovary stays. So the anthers and all that and the corolla all fall off. And they're in the same family as hibiscus. And hibiscus is used as a tea. You can find that in specialty shops. And it's about $8.50 for 1.5 ounces. So although this is a tedious thing, getting flowers, you know, $8.50 for, you know, $100 a pound. You can get somebody to deal with that. Then the seeds can be, we express it, either you can chemically extract the oil or you can do it physically, and then you're left with some pellets that can be used for feed. We made the biodiesel fuel, and then we took some out to Peoria, where the USDA has a lab that specializes in ag products. And Brian Mosier and his colleagues out there did a lot of work on that for us, and we have some papers out on that which give a stamp of approval to it, and not just some kooky thing that Denise and I did. And then we have another paper just came out looking at 15 of the accessions we have, comparing the fatty acid composition, and you can then from that say if you want to have oil that has more polyunsaturated and you want to use that to make biodiesel for northern states, and if you want southern states you can use more saturated. If you want to have ones that are more monounsaturated, you can get that. So you can, by what selection you use, you can change the fatty acid composition of the oil, and hence the different qualities of the biodiesel. The stems that have been around now, you see why they're so light. They're made up of millions of little capillaries that soak up about 11.5 times their own weight in fluid, either organic or water. We have papers on that too with other folks out there in Peoria. One of the things is to deal with is using it as bedding, because it soaks up the uric acid and water from the chicken manure. And we've done some testing of this with folks at the University of Delaware's experiment station in Georgetown. And Bill Brown was involved in this, and unfortunately he was killed in an accident this summer, so this is sort of on hold now. But here's the chicken foot here, and the problem is the uric acid in the manure causes dermatitis on the chicken feet, and this is one of the problems that degrades them. And so if you're going to sell them to Chinese for food, they don't want to eat chicken feet that have scars on them from the uric acid. And so we did this experiment, and there's Bill's paw looking at the chicken paw. And he has gotten the data here showing, comparing pine shaving, seashore mallow, switchgrass, and a couple of other miscanthus and so on in terms of the problem of dermatitis. And it turns out that this is on the second use of that for the second flock on that same litter, and we had no degraded paws, and the pine shavings, which were the standard, was about 8%. So if we have 2 million chickens going off the peninsula each week, and each with 2 feet, why we're talking then 4 million feet potentially going to China. And if they degrade 8% of them and multiply that by the number of flocks per year, then you're talking, even if it's only a few pennies, you're talking per foot, you're talking some significant amount of money. Oh, and here's that material is in this bag. I'll pass that around. You can see what that's just taking the whole thing and throwing it in that big chopper and having it, and then blowing it in the chicken house. Oops, I forgot to say this. This is the fiber that's on the outside, and that fiber is used by the Chinese to make cloth. So it's like using it like you would use flax. The other part of it, I have a sample up here of that, is the stem chopped up. That, in other words, what you saw that I passed around, the stem that I passed around, and then sieved to the certain size. Then that is a nice cat litter, absorbing a great deal of cat urine, and your cats smell good and all. So that's the mallow, and there's more about it, but you can write to us if you want to know more. We go now to looking at a vegetable, And this is seashore mallow. It's Atriplex triangularis. It's a relative of spinach. And here we're growing it in water that was pumped from the mouth of Delaware Bay. And there's the leaves of it there. It looks like spinach too. And then one of the things we made with it was a pasta. And you can use it any way. You can cook it up and use it any way you would use spinach, salad, and whatever. And another one is Salicornia. And there are several species, 3 of them actually, of that. And it is a succulent that looks like a little cactus. And it's pretty good to eat. It's salty. It deals with salt by simply accumulating water. So it swells up to dilute the salt. And so it gives you then all the salt that is, in the seawater. And we dry it and grind it up, and you can use it as you would salt, only it's more than just sodium chloride. It's got all the other things that are in the, Chris talked about all the wonderful things in seawater and the micronutrients and all that stuff. And it tastes good and so on. And then you can also, as we've shown here, it's been harvested and cleaned up. Then you can make pickles out of it. I made a little finger food where you bread it and deep fry it. Stick it around on the bar and sit there, and it tastes better and better the more beer you drink, they tell me. And so it's a pretty general kind of a food you can use. And it's a nice garnish on a steak or a piece of salmon. And the Batis marittima is another one that we're really just starting to work with that. It's also a succulent. Here's a field in Milford, outside of Milford, where the corn was stopped by salt, and volunteers of Atriplex, shown here, and Salicornia here came in. And so the fine habitat as a place to grow that sort of thing. The plants are also, and this is showing you the mallow as an example, but the others are likewise pretty flood tolerant because they evolved in the marshes. If they weren't, they wouldn't be there. And you can see the roots here on the mallow plant. That's a meter stick there. And this is 2 years old, this one. And this is one that shows that one of the things that happens is the roots grow up. So they'll grow towards the oxygen. And that's one of their ways of dealing with it. They also do have some biochemical means of not making alcohol. That's what seems to be the thing that gets a lot of plants in trouble. They get to drinking. They make alcohol as part of the metabolism, whereas some others, like this, will make lactic acid instead, and it's not toxic to them. So what we see is a situation here. This is again in Milford. And here we have the cornfield stopped by, you see it was planted here, but it died because of salt water. And if we turn and look towards the marsh, you can see there's a couple of corn plants right there, but most of this is frag which has come in. The Phragmites growing maybe 30 feet in a year. And so this area now, which was a cornfield, now is a dead zone. And so anything can wash out of that. There's no buffer. Chris was talking about buffers, but here the buffer is done long gone because it's no longer there. And you're going to get a buffer, but it's going to be Phragmites. And the Phragmites buffer then is going to grow down into the marsh and take out the marsh plants that are desirable and then invade up where the corn used to be. So we're concerned about having a buffer that actually can buffer. And so Chris was talking about planting those kinds of things. And, whoops, wrong button. And so I made a little diagram here of what we are thinking about here in that terms. And this, and you have a copy of that, I believe. This would be the way it was before man showed up here, and women too. We had a natural terrestrial ecosystem which had its own cycles within itself. And then things would go down towards the natural buffers, which have their own cycles, and then you get to the wetlands and the riverine and aquatic estuarine systems with their cycles, and then the ocean. So you would get ordinarily then some flow back and forth, and driven by the normal tides, which are shown here, that come up through the wetlands and so on, up into the natural buffers and what have you. Well, when we showed up, then we don't have all natural terrestrial ecosystems. We have then croplands with their cycles, and we have housing and businesses and recreation and Lord knows what goes on in those areas. And then they feed into the buffers. Now, when you get storm tides and then sea level rise, then you have this bigger loop here, which shows the flux is going to be up into the croplands, into the natural, and into the housing, business, and recreation, and so on. And the export from there is going to go down and through these systems. Now, what we're suggesting, since these things, the buffers, are sort of like sponges absorbing the stuff that comes from the upland, that eventually sponge gets sopping full and starts to leak. And so this natural buffer is going to do that. It's going to, the leaves are going to, after they've taken up all the nutrients that that particular buffer can take up, then the leaves drop, storm tide comes, and out they go, or even the normal tides get up into the natural buffers, hence they're buffers. But you're going to lose then materials out into the wetlands and into the oceans, which changes the regime there, contaminates it with whatever it is that we put out of our activities. And you have then the problems that you see in the bays and ocean and so on. So what we're suggesting here is that these alternative crops can keep that land functional and useful and as a managed buffer, and by the fact that you're harvesting those and taking the material away, if it's the salt hay or whether it's seashore mallow or the spinach relative or salicornia, you're harvesting and taking away that nutrients that are in that and taking it and using it so that that sponge doesn't get full and start to leak. So if we're going to manage things like the terrestrial systems and what have you, we're going to have to, I think, manage the buffers because they're going to be a big problem for us if the buffers that we do have are leaking. And so that would be a reason to try to keep those in production, not let them go into things like Phragmites, although Phrag picks up stuff, but we don't want it growing down into the wetlands. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and give the mic back to Chris and the clicker. And the clicker.
So this whole idea of income producing buffers is of particular interest to myself and us at the Plant Materials Center in Cape May. So I just want to throw out a few potential ideas here of growing conservation plans on these marginal lands or these transition areas that, you know, again, could refresh the buffer, also produce some income, rather than the option of just abandoning these areas. One thing we've seen happening, in particular with the salt hay or salt meadow cordgrass crop, is that, you know, no longer can producers go into the marsh and harvest the native stands anymore to a great extent because of storm damage to levees and dikes, which aren't being repaired. Sea level rise is creating a wetter condition there, a more saturated soil condition, and you can't get equipment on it. So this whole idea of growing your salt hay crop, which there still is a demand for and has a lot of benefits in these marginal areas. And we're going to be looking at, you know, what kind of potential yield we can get off these and those sorts of things. So we're sort of at the infancy stages of trying, you know, to identify this as a potential option for producers. But for example, I mean, the demand is still high and the supply is currently very low. And I've seen prices anywhere between $15 and $20 a bale in southern New Jersey if you wanted to, you know, use salt hay. The strawberry growers love it. It's great for curing concrete. It's just a very good mulch. And again, people are still interested in using it, but the supply just isn't there anymore. So that's a potential option for producers. Also harvesting native shrubs that can be used for soil bioengineering practices, which are basically using plants in a structural manner, which I have a slide of here in a little bit. You're harvesting dormant stems of these shrubs and using them to stabilize other areas that are eroding for shoreline stabilization purposes. Species such as groundsel or baccharis, a high tide bush, the viburnums, elderberry. There are some willows that have some level of salt tolerance, although most willows don't have a very high level of salt tolerance. But willows are typically used in stream bank freshwater situations, but we may have some opportunities to use those in saltwater environments also. And then lastly, planting a bioenergy crop in these areas, in these buffer areas, which you would be harvesting the biomass off of for on-farm use. So it's more of a small scale sort of thing, more of a on-farm use, either direct burning the residue or if you want to make the capital investment to purchase some hammer mills to grind the material up and to pelletize it, that small scale machinery is available and not all that too expensive. But things like switchgrass, coastal panic grass, prairie cordgrass are three main species that produce a fair amount of biomass and are used for this purpose, even in inland conditions, inland situations. But I want to make the point that the variety or the cultivar that you're using of that particular species does matter because, for instance, this high tide switchgrass, which we collected from the upper Chesapeake Bay in a freshwater environment, actually has shown tolerance to about 25 parts per thousand of salt concentration, which is basically back bay, highly brackish salt conditions, as well as the coastal panic grass, which is closely related to switchgrass, which grows on our barrier islands on dune, in a dune setting. It's very tolerant of droughty conditions, but it also grows in wet sites, as does switchgrass. Very tolerant of drought, but also grows in wet or flooded conditions. Prairie cordgrass is another native warm season grass, which is very common in the north central states of the United States. In the prairie pothole region, it's native here in the east, but it's highly underutilized for many different purposes, shoreline stabilization, biomass production, and we're trying to expand and enhance the use of that particular species for conservation here in the Mid-Atlantic area. It's all in the roots as far as its adaptation to flooding conditions and to a certain extent to salt conditions. This happens to be a small willow plant that was grown in a controlled environment at the Y Research Center in a PVC, about a 10 to 12 foot high PVC pipe filled with loose potting mix, and it shows what the potential root development is of willow and also switchgrass. So on the left-hand side is switchgrass. That root's about 12 feet tall, I would say, at least. So you have switchgrass roots extending almost to the ground from the top of that root on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you have willow roots. So you can see what the potential root development is of some of these conservation species. Now, obviously, they're not going to be that extensive or that deep necessarily in a situation where you have saturated conditions closer to the soil surface, or if you have some sort of an impediment as far as its root zone goes, a compacted layer or something like that. But it shows what the potential is. Another plant that is highly underutilized here is the eastern gamagrass. It has applications for shoreline stabilization, for improving soil health and breaking up compacted zones in the soil. It'll grow in a wet and a dry environment. So a lot of these species I'm talking about, not only tolerate wet, flooded, saline conditions, they also tolerate dry, droughty conditions. What allows these species, these native grasses in particular, to be adapted to wetter conditions is the development of what we call arenchyma roots. These arenchyma roots are straw-like. They're very thick roots with air spaces and allow for oxygen exchange under saturated conditions. Many of the native grasses, well, particularly the prairie cordgrass, the switchgrass, and the eastern gamagrass were the three that we tested, have shown a high degree of arenchyma root development. Switchgrass in particular has more of a higher percentage of fibrous roots. However, in a wetter environment, it will develop more of these arenchyma type roots, which allow it to be adapted to wetter conditions. That's why it's so variable as far as the site conditions it tolerates from wet to dry. We did a study back about 10 years ago or so. I can't believe it's been that long. Time flies when you're having fun. But we did it with the USDA-ARS, the Ag Research Service, out of the University Park Pasture Lab in central Pennsylvania. And we did both a controlled study in the greenhouse and then took the results and the same species we used in the control study to the field. This happens to be the field data. One is the best rating for that particular species for survival, vigor, yield, and then overall, you might want to concentrate on that last column there. So the lower the number, the better performer it was. The higher the number, the lower the performer. As it turns out, the three best performing species were prairie cordgrass, switchgrass, and eastern gamagrass. And it so happens that those three species also have a fairly decent level of salt tolerance. So they can be used, and again, that provides a little bit more credence and background on where these species can actually be used. This idea of salt hay. This is the salt meadow cordgrass, which grows a little higher in elevation behind the smooth cordgrass, which grows in the intertidal zone. But rather than going in and harvesting these native stands, is actually intentionally planting a crop of salt meadow hay to harvest, to be used for mulch, to be used for the other purposes that folks have liked to use the salt meadow hay. Now again, variety matters because we have a variety we selected at Cape May called Avalon from Avalon, New Jersey, and it grows like this. It's very fine stemmed. It sort of slumps over, forms these cowlicks, So that particular species, or that particular variety wouldn't be quite as desirable for harvesting for hay because you're not going to pick up as much of the biomass. However, there's a variety called Flagio, which we've also tested at Cape May, but was selected and released by our Georgia Plant Materials Center. The original material came from North Carolina, but it's much more stiff-stemmed and much more upright. So again, you have the potential of getting more biomass harvested from a hay crop from Flagio than you do in comparison to the Avalon. So plant variety matters. The other thought is the whole idea of harvesting these dormant, unrooted cuttings and stems. Again, for shoreline, to produce plants for other shoreline projects and actually create some income. Things such as groundsel or willow and shrub dogwoods have the ability to root from these unrooted cuttings and stems. And they're harvested when they're dormant. They're harvested at the base, and obviously because they're perennial, they'll regrow from the base every year. In fact, it regenerates the stand whenever you harvest these on a fairly frequent basis. And then you use these stems, in a soil, what we refer to as a soil bioengineering fashion, where we're actually laying the stems against, say, an eroded bank. We're bundling the material up in the form of what we call fascines or wattles. And then the material will sprout when the soil conditions warm up a little bit and the air temperature gets a little warmer in the spring. These dormant, unrooted stems will sprout, and the portion of the stem that's in contact with the soil will develop roots, and the portion of the stem that's exposed to the air will develop shoots, and then you'll have a stand of plants established to help stabilize these eroded areas. And there's many, many different practices that can be used, many different types of soil erosion practices or soil bioengineering practices that can be used with these cuttings and stems. Another idea we're looking at, based on some of the recommendations we got from the states that we queried, was how can we use these native species, these native warm season grasses, for instance, to control the spread of Phragmites in a buffer environment. So that's kind of an area we're going to be working towards as time goes on. And then we in Plant Materials Program support the grower industry, so we're going to want to try to get growers, seed producers and nursery growers to diversify their operations, to incorporate some of these species into their operations, and diversify rather than abandon some of these lands. We're going to work towards developing new markets for some of these techniques and some of these various plant materials. We can provide starter plants to growers to get them going with some of this stuff. And also indirectly, we provide marketing support because of all the information we have on our website on how to propagate the plant, what its use is, where it's adapted, and who has it, and who actually we have distributed to, and who might have an availability of it. So here's a list of some technical resources, and I believe this presentation will be available on site at some point on the website, and so you'll have these potential resources at your disposal.